Welcome back to another discussion of Theory and Practice by Jürgen Habermas. Tonight we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 6. And Chapter 6 is a very wide ranging chapter in which Habermas brings up quite a few different topics, ranging from difficulties with the way that sociology is practiced to whether Marxism is still a viable theory, to the idea of crisis in relation to dialectics, and there are a few other points in there as well. And the one thing I would like to focus on is the idea of dialectic itself. And I think there are some points that can be brought in about the way that the notion of dialectics has developed through the history of philosophy that can greatly add to a reader's understanding of how the term is used in Hegelian and Marxist thought. So, one of the primary ways in which both Marx and Hegel discuss the role of dialectic is in relation to its potential for understanding the world as something dynamic, as something in flux, where becoming rather than being is really the focus, what we're trying to understand. That is a different kind of emphasis than the kind of emphasis that has typically been given in the Western tradition to understanding reality since Plato. Because it's from Plato that we get our orientation toward reality in terms of knowledge and knowing in relation to what is permanent and fixed rather than what is in flux. And the, let's say, analytical tool that Hegel uses to try to deal with flux and change and to understand flux and change is the idea of dialectic. The core idea behind dialectic being that we can look at moments in history, moments of social change, as emerging from a unity of opposites. So, let's say a particular social relationship can be thought of as a unity, and the classic one would be the master servant dialectic. If we just think of that relationship as a unity, as a whole, we can see the potential for change if we look for the conflicting, contradictory elements in the relationship where they are in tension. So you could say that the unity results from the fact that the very idea of a master implies a servant, the very idea of a servant implies a master. The two mutually imply one another. And according to the picture that Hegel paints of the relationship between the two, the servant is always trying to work his way toward mastery. And in that process, the master may himself undergo a kind of negation to where he is no longer the master. That could be thought of as a template for how social change occurs. But to dig back into the history of philosophy a little bit, so that we can understand the process even better, even more intuitively, we can go back to Heraclitus and Parmenides for a moment, just to think about the relationship between flux and permanence as it emerges in the history of philosophy up to Plato. So you could say that in Plato's time, there was a kind of crisis, as Habermas describes it. A crisis is a point where a decision has to be made between two alternatives. And the crisis, perhaps, of philosophy at the time was deciding between whether to make permanence or flux the mainstay of one's perception of reality. Let's say the guiding metaphysical principle through which reality could be viewed. And Heraclitus took the view that change and flux was the primary lens through which we should view reality. If you really press on that point enough, if everything is in change and if everything is in flux, then there is no permanence. Permanence is merely a side effect or perhaps even an illusion of change. And reality is really the changing of things rather than their permanence. So if we were to say that something is the case, let's say that the glass is 50% full, that that fact, that statement about the way things are, can't be taken to have any permanence to it, except perhaps in some abstract form where we are abstracting away from reality. If we go back to reality, the truth of that statement is constantly in flux. If we want to look at the world and see the way things are in the world, then we have to look at those things in terms of change. We have to look at them in terms of flux. Now, Parmenides took the opposite view, and Parmenides is usually taken to be the inspiration for Plato's view that permanence is really has to be our guiding metaphysical principle when it comes to knowing things and what they really are. And given what I've just said about Heraclitus's vantage point, where you could say that change really takes us to the world, takes us to the things themselves, Plato took the opposite view and held that the only true reality of things is precisely what we can abstract from them. And if you look at the Platonic dialogues, it's really the question of knowledge that seems to uh, that that could be held to push Plato and perhaps Socrates before him toward that point of view. In order to be able to make any sort of claim about knowing anything, you have to make some claim about its reality as a permanent thing. So, if we take geometry as an example, the only way that we can really understand the reality of a triangle is by abstracting from everyday triangles and forming universal principles about what sort of properties a triangle has to be in order to be a triangle. And without doing that, we won't really arrive at knowledge of triangles. And you could say that at that point, we really have knowledge of something that is abstract. But it seems like Plato would be willing to bite that bullet and say that the true reality actually is not the way things appear to us, but the way that the requirements for knowing things suggest they must be. So the reality of triangles is going to be that ideal triangle rather than any particular triangle. So all of that is to suggest that Plato had to make a decision between both of these approaches to reality, flux and permanence. And the classic way of reading Hegel is to see him as trying to negotiate between these two different metaphysical principles to decide which one should have the upper hand. And his theory about the divided line is commonly read as his synthesis of these two opposing views of reality. And indeed, the two realities are different realities. the reality of the way things appear to us in the world and the way that we can frame models of reality in a logically consistent way belong to two entirely different realms, you might say. So, what does all of this have to do with dialectic? Well, as I said at the beginning, Hegel and Marx really want to use dialectic as a tool to bring us back to the flux of things and to understand things as being in flux. And dialectic can be used as a tool to understand that by looking at the change and permanence that is always going on at the same time in any given social situation. So you might have what Hegel or Marx could view as the positive aspect of a certain way in which a political structure has come to be formed. Positive meaning it actually is. This is the relatively permanent aspect of what a thing is as it exists at a historical period. But there are also seeds of change that are responsible for the flux, for the change, for the development, for the way in which society is becoming something else as opposed to the way it is. Okay. Now, this brings us into Aristotle and Aristotle's understanding of how change in the natural world occurs. For Aristotle, there are two kinds of change. There's accidental change and there's substantial change. And accidental change occurs when there is no change in an underlying, relatively permanent substrate. But there might be a change in quality or quantity or relation. So, for example, if Socrates goes for a walk and gets a suntan, Socrates as such has not changed. So, there is something there that is relatively permanent, but something else has changed, which is the suntan. And so, there's been a change from being not tan to being tan. So, you could say that there is a qualitative change. If Socrates underwent a substantial change, we could say that Socrates has ceased to exist and has become something else. Socrates has become dirt, has become a plant, has returned to the cycles of nature. So, within both of those types of change, you can see that there is a permanent aspect and an aspect of flux. Okay, so what I want to suggest is that this template for how to deal with change in the natural world became a basic template for how Hegel wanted to analyze social change. If we look at substantial change or accidental change, in either case, for Aristotle, if you look into his physics, you'll see that changing involves taking on another form of some kind. So if I have a piece of metal, this is not an example that I'm taking directly out of Aristotle, although I think there are some examples that are similar to this. If you take a piece of metal and you heat it up, you could say that the form of heat has been transferred from the heat source to the metal. So the metal has now taken on the form of heat. The form has been transferred from one thing to another, and that's what accounts for the change in this case. So the flux actually in this case comes down to opposites coming into relation with one another. We have a positive aspect over here with the thing that has the form of heat, and we have another thing over here, the piece of metal, which lacks the form of heat. And change is understood as a simple transference from quality that one thing has to a quality that the other thing now possesses. So you could say that we've gone from not having heat, not having the form of heat, to having the form of heat. and that transference is Aristotle's explanation of how either type of change goes on in the physical world. But there's always going to be an underlying substrate until the form itself has ceased to exist for a particular being. If we look at Hegel's way of looking at how social change occurs, there's something very similar to that that's going on. So, with the French Revolution, there was a feudal, there were aspects of feudal society still present in French society at the time. There was a structure that that was still existing at the time of French Revolution that was present in feudal society. So there was a king, there were aristocrats in positions of political power for no other reason than that they were born into them. And those types of positions of power and that structure led to an arrangement of society that tended to maintain those positions of power in relation to a middle class, which was coming more and more into being and coming more and more into understanding itself as a social class that eventually would resist that type of domination. And so, in those conditions, the French Revolution occurred. And what explains the, the change that occurred from the standpoint of dialectic is that you have a unity of opposites at the beginning. You have French society as it existed in the 18th century. But the opposites, the underlying conflict that the unity concealed, was the conflict between feudal society and the emerging bourgeois society that had developed since the end of the Renaissance, with the development of the towns in northern Italy that sparked the beginning of a move toward middle class society in European countries. So, those are the opposites. That's the change that occurred. And eventually, one pair of those two opposites negated the other. So, bourgeois society negated feudal society from a certain point of view. And so we went from non being to being. Underneath it, we still have the continuity that still is going on. The French people, French society, but it has been radically changed. Another aspect of the term dialectic that can be helpful in understanding the whole picture here is the way in which dialectic emerges in the Platonic dialogues. And one aspect that I think is particularly helpful in understanding the idea of negation and what might be termed the positive aspects versus the negative aspects of change is that in the Platonic dialogues, when we see dialectic actually being played out, we have one person who throws out a theory and another person who's questioning that theory, which is usually Socrates, or which is, yeah, almost always Socrates. And the person who's questioning the theory is trying to find ways in which aspects of the theory that don't work can be removed from the theory. And later Neoplatonists termed this type of removal the via negativa. I believe that term via negativa is from Augustine. But the idea there is that there is a negative way, there's a negative path that characterizes the beginning of the dialectical process. Dialectical process being, first of all, the relationship between the two participants in the dialogue. One person holding the theory, the other questioning the theory, one holding it as something positive, something that's being asserted, and the other, someone who is trying to purge away, pare away, trim away the aspects of a theory that don't work. So that's the via negativa, the negative way. The term aphyresis is sometimes used to describe this, which is a purging away, a cleansing away of aspects of a theory that don't work. And this stage of the dialectic eventually gives way to a via positiva, which is a stage at which we can begin to move away from just saying what a particular thing is not, such as justice. We can begin saying that justice is not this, it's not that, it's not something else, moving toward a more positive statement about what it is, emerging out of that stage of negation. So, that overall picture of what dialectic is all about may play very well into the whole Hegelian picture about the teleological aspect of history. As we proceed through history, we're going to go through various stages of negation. The ideal society is not this, it's not that. There's going to be an aspect of cleansing, aphyresis, taking away, purging away, until we can finally arrive at what the ideal society actually is. And for Marx, the ideal society that's going to emerge at the end of this process of dialectic, as it actually plays out in history, is first of all, a socialist state and ultimately a communist state. So you can see there how these terms can gain a little bit of extra intuitive sense. There's a way in which the historical background can be helpful as providing us with some tools for reading Hegel and Marx. One other point that I'll make about this is that there is a sense in which dialectic reveals the founded or constructed or made aspect of the way that knowledge comes to be realized, revealed, comes into being through this process of throwing out theories and refining them and shaping them until we finally arrive at something that really works, something that gets closer to the hypothetical ideal, the ideal of justice or the idea of good. And that made or forged or constructed aspect emerges in dialectic precisely in its aspect of having been created at a particular situation between two different interlocutors at a moment in time. We could bring in the educational opportunities they might have had, both from a social aspect and from a historical aspect. As we move forward in history, more and more insights become available to us that may not have been available to people who lived at earlier times. And that constructed, found, made aspect of knowledge, in that it is actually created as a process that results from the work of the participants in the discussion, goes side by side with those intuitive feelings we have that we've really discovered something about the nature of justice, or we've really grasped something about the universal nature of the good. When we've decided that the good can't be this and it can't be that, or that justice can't be this and it can't be that, perhaps we begin to arrive at a clearer view of what it must be. And so we become more and more willing to arrive at some kind of positive formulation. You might say that the goal of the person who's in the position of Socrates, the person who's responsible for purging away the inconsistent or false elements of a theory about what is just or good or what the ideal society should be like, is in the role of trying to purge away elements of a theory that merely appear to be good and well founded, but are not. And oftentimes that's going to involve purging away elements that might have induced the person who formed the theory to say them just by virtue of basic prejudices or flaws in the person's thinking, societal factors that can pressure a person to see the world in one way as opposed to another. And so the purging that's going on in the discussion can, in a sense, be a way in which some sort of objectivity is obtained strictly by trying to move a theory toward adhering to the conditions that a theory would have to be something that really could be known. So it would have to be something that's logically consistent. If any theory is going to be a theory that's susceptible of knowledge, then it must be something that is logically consistent. And if Plato is placing his bets on the idea that there is some sort of reality that corresponds to the good or the just or the ideal society, and he's placing his bet on the idea that those ideals are susceptible of real knowledge, then they have to be self consistent theories. So, just to bring it back to the main point, this third point that I'm making about the nature of dialectics, there's something made about them. There's a constructed aspect that goes side by side with the sense that we've really discovered something simply because it adheres to the conditions that any theory would have to meet in order for it to be something that could be known. It appears that Plato really wanted to say, in the interests of knowledge over relativistic thinking, that he was simply going to identify the forms of things with things that were truly susceptible of knowledge. So, for those who are trying to work their way up to a higher reality, for those who are involved in an enlightenment type project where they might believe in the possibility of our social evolution toward better and better ways of living, more and more ideal societies, there is a certain amount of faith that enters the picture when it comes to thinking that the kinds of societies that we're able to envision for ourselves really are better, not in a relativistic sense, but they're better in a sense that they're closer and closer to the real ideal of a really ideal society, and that reason and rationality can light our path toward achieving that goal. So, with that, the last and final point that I'm going to make is simply that you can line up those two aspects of dialectic, the constructed, made aspect with the aspect that tends to suggest that there is something really truly reasonable, something intuitively knowable that we can find through reason itself toward the ideal, that we can align those concepts up with theory and praxis. So praxis is the activity, the working out of the dialectic among the disputants. And theory is that what emerges, the thing that emerges from the discussion that can be a subject for further work. So with that, and next time we can look at chapter 7, which will be the final chapter in theory and practice.